Picture this. Think of the most luxurious celebrations in the world. We're talking a royal wedding, a massive New Year's Eve bash, maybe a huge championship sports victory. What's the one thing they literally all have in common? Yep, a bottle of champagne. It is the absolute ultimate global symbol of elegance and success. But what if I told you that the origin of this sparkling golden beverage wasn't born out of luxury at all? Actually, it was born out of absolute chaos. So, in this explainer, we're going to look closely at the shocking, explosive, and honestly completely accidental true story behind the invention of champagne. Now, if you know anything about champagne, you've probably heard this legendary story. The date is August 4th, 1693, and a French Benedictine monk named Dom Perignon supposedly takes a sip of his latest wine creation and famously shouts, "Come quickly, I am tasting the stars," right? It's a beautifully romantic, thrilling backstory for a legendary drink. But, well, there's just one massive problem with this tale. Aside from the fact that a monk named Dom Perignon actually did exist and he did make wine, the rest of this story, the purposeful invention of sparkling champagne and that famous quote, is a complete myth. It was totally fabricated long after his death. Okay, so let's dive into this mystery. If the guy credited for centuries with inventing champagne didn't actually do it, who did? Who is really responsible for the bubbly drink we know and love today? Honestly, answering this question completely flips the history of this luxurious beverage right on its head. To understand the real story, we first kind of have to understand the modern strictness of its name. You've probably heard the rule. Unless it comes from the specific Champagne region in northeast France, it's just sparkling wine. This rule is called an appellation, and it was first granted legal protection way back under the 1892 Madrid Agreement. But this highly regulated, distinctly French identity, it's actually deeply ironic, especially when you consider the chaotic, cross-cultural, and purely accidental history of the region itself. You see, for well over 1,000 years, the Champagne region was incredibly famous, but absolutely not for bubbles. Let's go back to the 1st century, when the Romans introduced vines to the area. By 496 AD, King Clovis of the Franks was baptized in Reims, and local wine flowed freely at his coronation. This permanently associated the region's wine with French royalty. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and the area is hosting these massive 6-week-long trade fairs linking European economies. But here is the crazy secret about all of this. For centuries, the beloved wine they were producing was actually a pinkish, flat, non-sparkling wine made from the Pinot Noir grape. The bubbles hadn't even arrived yet. So how did they get there? Well, the actual invention of champagne began not with some brilliant spark of genius, but with a dramatic freezing shift in the global climate. During the 17th century, the world experienced what is known as a Little Ice Age. This sudden drop in temperatures made wine production in the cold northern extremes of the Champagne region incredibly difficult. And, as it turns out, it perfectly set the stage for an explosive accident. This climatic shift absolutely terrorized French winemakers. The freezing winter weather would cause the wine's normal yeast fermentation to just stop prematurely. Then, when the weather finally warmed up in the spring, the yeast would wake back up and abruptly restart the fermentation process while already sealed inside the bottles. This released a massive amount of carbon dioxide. And because the French glass of that era was really quite flimsy, the immense pressure would violently shatter the bottles right in the cellars. One exploding bottle would often set off this terrifying chain reaction, taking out entire cellars at once. The winemakers certainly didn't see this as a luxury. They were horrified. They actually dubbed this dangerous, defective liquid Le Vin du Diable, or the devil's wine. Section 1. The Master Blender. The true legacy of Dom Perignon. Enter Dom Perignon in 1668. He arrives at the Abbey of Hautevillers not as some whimsical inventor of bubbles, but as a highly skilled cellar master sent to fix a massive problem. The French court was starting to shun the region's wines. And this perfectly illustrates the ultimate dramatic irony of the whole story. When you compare the myth to the reality, Dom Perignon was indeed a brilliant master at blending wines to produce a really consistent flavor. But he actually spent his entire life desperately trying to remove the bubbles and stop those deadly explosions. He thought the fizziness was a massive flaw. So, if the French monks were actively fighting against the bubbles, who actually invented the sparkling wine we know today? Let's look at Section 2, the unlikely hero, an English physician. Here is the crucial twist. The deliberate creation of sparkling champagne wasn't French at all. On December 17, 1662, which is a full 3 decades before Dom Perignon supposedly tasted the stars, An English physician named Christopher Merritt presented a totally groundbreaking paper to the Royal Society. Merritt realized that you could deliberately force this bubbly texture by fortifying the wine with sugar and molasses. But crucially, he solved the explosive problem of the devil's wine. You see, English glassmakers were using much heavier, sturdier glass. By bottling the carbonated liquid in this incredibly strong English glass, they could safely contain all that immense pressure without triggering a cellar-destroying explosion. It was the English who were the first to intentionally produce and safely store bubbly wine. No way, right? It took a little time, but the bottles of sparkling wine that actually survived eventually made their way back over to French royalty as a really popular novelty. Between 1670 and 1720, the French elite, including King Hugh Capet and the Duke of Orleans, completely embraced the sparkling English invention. The deliberate production of sparkling wine finally took root in the region, essentially transforming the devil's wine from a dangerous, defective nuisance into a highly sought-after status symbol. Section 3. The Widows Who Saved Champagne. Now, having a popular novelty drink for royals is very different from running a reliable global industry. To transform champagne into the empire it is today, it required the sheer ingenuity of an incredible group of 19th century women. At the time, French law restricted women from owning businesses without a husband or father's permission. However, there was a major legal loophole. Widows were completely exempt. So these three brilliant women used the highly respectable title of veuve, or widow, to take control and innovate. Barbe Nicole Ponsardin invented a process called riddling that finally solved the problem of removing dead yeast cells from the bottles, and she expanded their market all the way to Russia. Louise Pommery developed the dry, brut champagne that perfectly captured the English palate. And Lily Bollinger completely mastered marketing, bringing champagne straight to the United States. They didn't just participate in the industry, these women completely revolutionized how champagne was made and sold. And thank goodness for the foundation laid by these women, because this growing industry had to be incredibly resilient. The Champagne region endured massive devastation during heavy fighting in both World War I and World War II. On top of that, the Russian Revolution banned champagne imports entirely, labeling the drink as decadent. And of course, prohibition in the United States severely crippled international sales. Yet through it all, the industry rebounded and survived. Which brings us to Section 4, a global symbol of celebration. Emerging from the ashes of the 20th century, champagne absolutely cemented its legacy as the permanent ceremonial centerpiece for humanity's greatest moments. To truly understand how synonymous it became with celebration, just look at maritime traditions. For centuries, regular wine was used to christen ships. But starting in 1890, when the U.S. Navy's first steel battleship, the USS Maine, was completed, they used champagne. Queen Victoria soon followed suit with the HMS Royal Arthur. And why? Because that explosive, dramatic pop on impact perfectly matched the grandeur and excitement of the occasion. That transition into a global necessity brings us right up to today. Because of the strict trade regulations and appellation rules we discussed earlier, over 200 million bottles of authentic French champagne are sold every single year. It is a massive testament to the region's perseverance and their absolute marketing genius. Yet, here is an absolutely fascinating piece of context for you. Despite selling 200 million bottles, authentic French champagne represents only about 1 in every 12 bottles of the massive $38 billion global sparkling wine industry. By legally restricting the name champagne exclusively to their region, they've maintained a highly protected, exclusive allure that literally towers over the rest of the market. I want to leave you with this wonderfully provocative thought from one of our pioneer widows, Lily Bollinger. She said, "I drink champagne when I'm happy and when I'm sad. Otherwise, I leave it alone unless I'm thirsty." It really reminds us that whether this drink was born from a terrifying, accidental winter explosion or meticulously calculated by an English scientist, its true magic is its versatility. It has evolved from a dreaded devil's wine to a beverage that can effortlessly elevate any moment of your life, big or small. So, next time you hear that famous cork pop, you'll know exactly what it took to get those stars in your glass. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. It really makes you wonder, what other happy accidents of history are hiding right now in your refrigerator? Cheers to the amazing history of champagne.